Hey, this is a special episode where we have Ace Atkins, Pulitzer Prize-nominated novelist Ace Atkins, and Sports Illustrated cover, not artist, but cover man, which is the first time and probably only time we'll have that. But yeah, he's got a graphic novel adaptation of his first novel, Crossroad Blues, with Marco Finnegan, coming out on Wednesday, April 25th, so we wanted to throw this up before the book comes out. But let's let Ace talk all about it. And maybe, just maybe if you're lucky, you'll get a Blues Brothers 2000 reference and a RoboCop reference. Maybe. And joining us this week, we have Pulitzer Prize-nominated novelist Ace Atkins. An adaptation of his Nick Travers novel Crossroad Blues with Marco Finnegan is out in comic book stores everywhere and on Comixology if you're more digitally inclined on Wednesday, April 25th. Ace, thanks for coming on the show.
Hey, my pleasure.
So with Nick Travers, you've kind of got this, he's hard-boiled like a Raymond Chandler or like Dashiell Hammett character, but he's also very distinctly from the Bayou. He's very distinctly from the Mississippi Delta. A lot of the action here takes place in Louisiana, some of it directly in New Orleans. Was it kind of an attempt to kind of create a more kind of Cajun hard-boiled hero?
Well, I mean, it really kind of came from two different places. This graphic novel is based on a novel that actually was published 20 years ago. And so I wrote this book when I was 26 years old, and this was my first effort. This was my first book that ever came out. And kind of the place I was coming from was really what you mentioned, which is my, love and appreciation of classic hard-boiled fiction like Hammett and Chandler. But also I was really deeply into blues music at that time. So I was really into Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf and Robert Johnson. And those two kind of art forms really, as different as they may seem, have a lot of similarities. And so what I wanted to do was kind of merge those two. And that's how Crossroad Blues came about. It was the first thing I'd ever done, the first thing I'd ever published. And then here we are exactly 20 years later, and now it's taken on new life as a graphic novel.
How did it how did this adaptation what made you want to bring it into the comic book medium?
Man, I have to say I can take zero credit for this. Marco actually reached out to me a few years ago on Twitter, and we just started talking. And another one of the books that I write is several years ago. I took over the Robert B. Parker Spencer series. If you guys remember the old TV show that used to be on the 80s, Spencer for Hire. Mm-hmm. And the family hired me to keep that series going after the passing of Mr. Parker. And Marco was a big fan of that series, and he sent me some drawings of the Spencer character in that Spencer world. And it was just terrific, and he has a very unique look to his art. It's a very hard-boiled image. It's black and white. It's very spare. It's very lean. And then we just kind of moved into talks about doing something, different, doing something with my own stories. And so that's how we arrived back at my very first novel.
With the this entire mystery, Crossroads Blues, kind of follows, a blues mystery. It very much kind of, and there's something about New Orleans, or really just the Delta area in general, that bluegrass kind of thing. There's a rhythm to that in that part of the country. Was that something that was consciously if I'm going to have a detective in this region, that needs to be an element of the character?
Sure, man. I mean, for me, I'm from the South. I'm originally from Alabama. I live in Mississippi now, and many of the stories that we would read that would be hard-boiled fiction would be stories that would be set in New York or Los Angeles or Chicago. And so I wanted to do a character who is very indigenous and felt and would be very at home down south. And of course, even more than just the world that of being in the deep South, but to write about, particularly about New Orleans, which is a very, very specific place. Even really its own cultural spot down there. And I really wanted to capture the feel of New Orleans and create a character and a hero who resonated with the New Orleans feel.
With the, I have to ask, just because this question and this topic comes up quite a bit during Crossroad Blues.
Sure.
What is your stance on Elvis Presley?
That's funny, man. What do I think about Elvis Presley?
Sure, yeah. What is it? Thumbs up, thumbs down, thumb straight across, Graceland, or?
Man, I love it. I love Elvis. And somebody was asking me earlier today, was it a conscious decision to have Elvis in the story where he actually is taking part of the blues music and taking it for himself. And, I think those parallels could, definitely could be drawn as far as the story, but absolutely not my intention. I mean, living here in the South, knowing the history of Elvis, I've even been fortunate enough to know people who knew Elvis and those kind of connections. I'm a fan, and I think that, he really was more than just somebody who tried to mimic the music. He was somebody who really loved blues, and he loved that music and wanted to bring it to, a larger audience. It wasn't something that he wanted to take for himself. It was something that he really deeply felt. So yeah, definitely a big thumbs up for Elvis.
Good. I mean, you could go either way. I mean, I have no vested interest in Mr. Presley, though I do love the King of Rock and Roll. I do have to.
Well,
yeah.
You have to come down. You come down here and you visit Graceland, and even if you're a non-believer and you're not truly an Elvis, once you go down, come down here and you visit Graceland and you see, really all he accomplished in his music, then you kind of start becoming a true believer.
Well, there is something. I mean, you're talking about going down in the true belief of blues. This is kind of, there's a very, with Crossroad Blues, you're looking at stuff that's really pre-rock and roll. You're looking at like 1920s, 1930s. Abstractly, what is it about the blues? Can it be something as family-friendly or mass market as, say, Blues Brothers or even Blues Brothers 2000? Or is there something?
Man. You're bringing up some bad stuff. I just ate, man. Don't bring up the Blues Brothers 2000. Although I do like the Blues Brothers very much.
Sure.
And again, it's the Blues Brothers are something that brought pop culture to blues to popular audience and that kind of thing. So I really dig the Blues Brothers, but as far as asking what is it? Are you asking what is it about blues? What makes it so?
Yeah, does it have? Yeah, especially with the more kind of like the older blues that this story focuses on. What is it about that kind of more grassroots, pre-rock and roll, pre-rhythm and blues?
It's really edgy, and it is the before rock and roll. What inspired it certainly was blues music, and what blues music became rockabilly and inspired Elvis, and became things that inspired people like Chuck Berry, and then brought rock and roll to the world. Certainly started with the deep roots of blues music here in the Deep South, whether it was in Alabama or Mississippi and that kind of thing. But what attracted me to that sound, and what attracted me to that music, and what inspired me was because it really did have that. Going back to connections with like noir, hard-boiled stories. I mean, there's nothing more gritty and dark than some of the images, brought and written by Robert Johnson, or, all these great performers of that time period, going back going even longer after that or before that, some of the incredible people, Memphis Minnie, and all these wonderful performers really almost had something in common with the classic hard-boiled school, for sure.
Now, for the listeners that aren't maybe necessarily in the know, Nick Travers, that's not just Crossroad Blues. There's a whole series of Nick Travers novels. What was it? First off, what was it that made Image kind of the right publisher for your collaboration with Marco? And second off, I know this may be a bit premature, but are there any plans to kind of adapt more of the novels down the line?
Well, I hope so. I think, Marco, again, was really the catalyst for all this. I mean, my world is writing novels. I've written 23 books. I've been doing this now for 20 years, and, I am a fan of graphic novels, but he was the one who really took the stories, adapted them, gave them a really specific look, and, certainly came from a place of my appreciation of Marco's work, that I knew that he was the right guy to do it. He certainly had the eye to do it. But I'm hoping, the first book that we did together was a story called Last Fair Deal Gone Down, which was a short story about Nick Travers. And that was, like a 40, 50-page story that Marco was able to almost get, almost all of it within the story. And then, of course, when you take on a novel that's about 300 pages, there's a lot that, remains on the cutting room floor as far as what he's able to represent in that book. But really what I'm hoping is that, there's 3 other Nick Travers stories. I'm hoping that we will progress with those stories, and Marco can, bring those to the page. And then what I'm hoping after that is that, that we collaborate on some new stories for him, because I think there's a lot of unearthed, a lot of things that I have in mind yet, a lot of stories that, even though this is a character that I don't write about anymore, or not currently as a novelist, I would love to see him come back. I think there's a lot of great stuff in it, and I think that he's a character that really works well for that format, for the graphic novel format.
Well, to kind of speak of the character in general, other than just being his first, the first novel that you ever wrote, what does Nick Travers, what does he represent, and what does he mean to you on a more abstract level? What does he, how does he personify the Delta, the Mississippi Delta area, the bayou?
Well, I think he's a character that I always thought about, really straddling both of the worlds, of both being in the world, the white world and the black world, and also straddling that world as far as, appreciating, really what is the best about the South. And being a Southerner, really the things that I see that really stand out to me is, friendships between the two communities and the building of the bridges. And you really see what happened with music, and you see things like with Elvis, where, Elvis as a young man, was fascinated and intrigued by the black community and wanted to, embrace that music and all those, those great barriers that, soul music brought down. And so that's really what Nick Travers was all about, is somebody who really has a foot within both of the communities in New Orleans, or then going up into Mississippi and the Delta. And so there really is, it's a truly multicultural cast when you get into these books, as far as Nick entering this world. And, he's sometimes a little bit out of step, finding his way in the community, and sometimes is a little bit mistrusted, and there's mistrust on both sides. But I think he represents what's really good about the South. He represents really some of the good Southern stories that I see.
Right. Now that you kind of mention it, like, we're from Virginia, which is South, but not. You got us beat on the geographically on how.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. We still like stuff fried, and we still like our grits up here, but but you don't really see those kind of like race positive characters coming from like stories set in the South. There's always communities kind of that are more at odds. And the more I think about it, Nick being an aficionado of the blues and being an ex-football player, both of those things are community building things between the two. Yeah,
absolutely. That's a really good point. And my own background, I played football in college, and my experience was very multicultural, where we really had a wonderful mix of students and people that were part of a football team, and then being somebody who appreciated the music. A lot of the best things that come out of the South, or some of the best things that come out of I think that the American experience, to even take it even broader in general, come from the blending of cultures. And really, before we get bigger than that, you think about New Orleans, and in New Orleans, what a big, huge, cultural impact that has had. That comes from the blending of all the cultures of Creole and Cajun and black and white, and people from the Caribbean and France and Spain and all that stuff. So, that's the fun stuff to write about. It's the fun thing to write about the history of it. And, even like something like Crossroad Blues, which is, this great, starts off with this great Southern myth, which is the death of Robert Johnson.
Speaking of your football background for a second, you were on the front cover of Sports Illustrated, right?
I was.
That is freaking
a long time ago.
That is so freaking cool. Like,
that's a first for this show.
I know
this comic book show. We get nobody.
And for the listeners at home, look it up. It's a badass cover too, because you're sacking at the time a future Heisman Trophy winner. Like, and you just look like a freaking
shit house.
Yeah,
brick shit house.
You are towering. Like, it's badass. It's awesome.
It was a long time ago, but even though back then, man, I tell you what, I loved living in Auburn. There was a comic book store that also was the vinyl store, and we had a used bookshop and all that. So I've always been into all different things. I've always loved all that. So even though I was into football at that time, I really I couldn't wait for the next week to go to the comic book store, go to the record shop or whatever, and just look at everything that I really dig pop culture.
So this is a total shot in the dark, because we asked this. This has become kind of like a question we ask everybody.
Yeah.
It's And speaking of pop culture, what are your memories, if any, of RoboCop? I know it's totally out there, but we've had this string of people on the show.
I like to joke that we've had people that have worked on the RoboCop book, but I like to think or joke that we're a RoboCop appreciation podcast, but then sometimes I wonder if we're joking.
Well, I have a podcast solely dedicated to RoboCop. No, but it's
I probably, if you want to get in the RoboCop movie, I'm old enough that I saw it in theaters. But probably I'm probably more of a Buckaroo Banzai guy. So if it comes
Peter
down
Weller
to really
still
Peter
nice, yeah,
Peter Weller films in general, I probably kind of edge towards Buckaroo Banzai. But I still dig RoboCop. I mean, all those '80s movies, I love all that stuff. I loved. I grew up with that. I was a teenager during the '80s, and so all that stuff was. I was talking. I had a conversation with a buddy of mine last night, and we were talking about all the Schwarzenegger movies that really were underappreciated. We got into a conversation about Commando, and I was like, yeah, Commando is one of the great Schwarzenegger films for sure.
Yeah, it's funny because, I know we're joking about talking about RoboCop, but it says something about.
Are we ever joking talking about?
Well,
RoboCop?
but just bringing it up, that's so there wasn't even a nice segue for that. I was just like, you like RoboCop, but but seriously though, it says something about all the people we talk to on this podcast. It's such a strong thing of pop culture that we can make that just random leap to RoboCop, and you're not
sure.
What the hell's RoboCop? You know what I mean? It's still so ingrained in people and people like us, people who love pop culture and comic books and movies and all that kind of crazy stuff. And the fact that I was just going to say real quick, and the fact that when you were on the cover of Sports Illustrated, I think was the year RoboCop 3 came out. So,
full circle.
So, yeah, you were probably on the rack somewhere. Yeah.
It all relates.
There you go. Exactly.
So that makes, you're a fan of 80s movies, fan of Buckaroo Banzai, and that sort of thing, fan of the blues. What was your kind of exposure into the pulp crime world, the Parker novels or Sam Spade or Philip Marlowe?
Well, I got into books in general where, I went from kind of a, casual reader as a kid to somebody who was, really combing through, secondhand bookshops and, old paperback stores and stuff, really through James Bond. And so when I was about 14 years old, I discovered James Bond and, for the novels. And I just thought that it was the greatest thing ever, and of course it's filled with all kinds of sex and violence and, it's just everything that a 14-year-old kid wants to, explore. And so that's how I got into books. And so, I went right through the James Bond series, read everything that Ian Fleming had written. And then that kind of led me into other books, that led me into Chandler and Hammett. And it led me into, coming across Robert B. Parker, who was very popular at that time, and it created Spencer. So I was spending my weekends just going to the used paperback shops and getting as many of the old paperbacks as I could find.
It's funny you bring up James Bond because one, we also do a James Bond podcast, but
we're really all over the place.
But
we have a Beatles podcast.
Yeah, but recently I grew up watching the movies. My dad showed me all the Sean Connery ones, and then you kind of just discover all the other ones on your own and have your favorites here and there. But I had never George
Lazenby.
Yeah, Timothy Dalton. But I had as a kid, I had kind of fiddled around with the books, but recently I really kind of sat down and through the Audible book series, been making my way through the James Bond original novels. And I think some of for some people I think they look at them as kind of trashy or throwaway kind of novels, whatnot.
Sure.
But I some of the books I'm only 4 books deep. But Moonraker, for example, was one that I read that has nothing to do with the Roger Moore movie. I mean, it's all funny, camp, and cheesy.
No.
But I was kind of amazed, and I don't want to sound like a diss to the Ian Fleming kind of legacy, but I was amazed at how really powerful the James Bond books are. There's some stuff.
Well, they really are, and I think Fleming was frustrated himself. Of course, his legacy is kind of earned out. I think we can now all step back and say he created something really amazing.
Mm-hmm.
But it all goes back to the books, and the books are fantastic. And Fleming was a terrific writer. I mean, he was a journalist. He was a professional journalist, and he was a terrific writer, and somebody who could just capture a scene. And he also had, so much knowledge of world travel and politics, and he had been a correspondent for the London Times in Russia, and he understood the current situation that was going on with Russia and the communists in the 1950s, the Red Scare, and all that. But he was a great writer, and I don't think he, even to this day, really gets his due. But we do kind of see it in the films where the films go through those cycles where they're really terrific, and then they start to suck. And then they get terrific again, and it always is when the producers go back to the source material. And something like Casino Royale with Daniel Craig is really spot on with the novel. I mean, even though it's set 50 years later, as far as what is happening, is pretty much like it is in the books. And but he's a terrific writer, wonderful writer. And Fleming and Chandler were great friends, and they were mutual admirers of their work. And there's a wonderful, if you ever really want to go down this road, there's a great interview. I guess you'd almost say it was an early podcast where it would be Fleming and Chandler talking, and I think both of them are really drunk, and they're recording this for a radio show, and they're talking to each other for I think Fleming is in Jamaica or in London, and Chandler, of course, is in Los Angeles, and they're having this conversation, and it's great. It's just really interesting to hear these two really geniuses of hero-driven novels talk about their craft.
Speaking of, novels being, adapted, I don't know if you saw, but I think it was a week or two ago at the time of this recording, there's a really beautiful hardcover graphic novel adaptation of Casino Royale that came out.
Nice.
That's
nice.
Really, it's really cool. And then Dynamite Entertainment, the comic publisher, has been doing the original James Bond comic books for a little while now, in like kind of these great like 6-issue almost like mini movies that are really good.
Well, I got to know Warren Ellis, who was involved in those, and I know Warren from a book conference we were in Europe some time ago, and I got to hang out with him. And I think at the time we were talking about Fleming, and this was before I think it was announced that he was going to be doing the graphic novels. But they certainly had that feel. I mean, they almost feel aesthetically like an early graphic novel. Very violent. Characters are very unique, very edgy. You think about characters like Odd Job or some of the femme fatales. It lends itself to that form.
Yeah, there is definitely kind of it's a very kind of visual storytelling there.
Yeah, and it's amazing.
Oh, sure. And the other thing about Fleming that leads him, I think, to being more of like in the graphic novel form is the kind of the quirkiness of it, the edginess, the kind of the characters are a little bit larger than life and a little bit odd, and that's what made him, I think, very different. Even like kind of the kinkiness and fetishness that they had in the Fleming novels lends itself to that form as well. But they're just terrific.
Yeah, I think it's The Spy Who Loved Me, where he just like he goes into like pretty extensive detail about. Well, he always goes into extensive detail about the villains, but he also, like in that book in particular, he goes into extensive detail about that book's protagonist, who isn't James Bond. And it's like, and then she like,
it's a woman.
Yeah, and she like has like all kinds of like sex and stuff. We find out her entire sexual history is Fleming is want to disclose in all of his.
Well, and as you can see as we talk about this, why this was so important for a 15-year-old boy to read this stuff. But but the people who don't know Fleming, we should do just a James Bond podcast. We'll just talk about James Bond. But it was all the entire novel. It's not about Cold War and submarines and like the film. Mm-hmm. It's set in a little motel in the Adirondacks, and James Bond is just a secondary character who doesn't show up to the third act. And but it's a terrific book. It's almost like a Hitchcock story.
Yeah. Now, to kind of tie it back to Crossroad Blues a bit, you were mentioning that Fleming was kind of a frustrated novelist, and he was drawing from his background, working like during secret intelligence services during the Cold War and World War II. With before you became a novelist, you were a journalist. You see a lot of that kind of investigative journalism with Nick Travers, as he's kind of going through history. Is that are those the same kind of muscles you used from your creatively or writing wise from your journalism days, or is that something you draw from, as a writer?
Well, I was always intrigued when I was a reporter, and I got into reporting right when I got out of school, and I love the ideas. I love to do the history pieces, and I love to meet people who were connected to. I did stories that were based on, or were connected to things, crimes that had happened 30, 40, 50 years ago, and to find out, what had happened, and I did a series about a woman who had been killed in 1956. This was when I was working in Tampa. And, I had to track down her friends and people that were connected to her, and even cops that had worked the case and all that. And I found that stuff very exciting and interesting. And I think that, kind of when I was doing that kind of work for the paper, it kind of influenced what I like to do, with Nick Travers, which is, it's not something that's happening in this time frame. It's something that happened 60 years ago, and then to find people that know all the different pieces of the puzzle and to see it come together. So certainly that was something that, was in the back of my mind. But I really have to say, not on my own experiences. It really went back to stories that I really liked. In particular, probably, definitely the Maltese Falcon. And so that was really heavy on my mind, which is to do something like the Maltese Falcon in modern day, and to do something in New Orleans, and what would be, what would be the Falcon? What would be the thing that they would be chasing? What would people be obsessed with? And, it had to be Robert Johnson.
I feel like you would then be you have to be a big fan of Altman's Long Goodbye with Elliot Gould.
Oh yeah,
because that basically transports Marlowe to then modern day Los Angeles, and he's kind of an anachronism throughout that entire film.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what Altman said. He said he wanted to do Rip Van Marlowe, and have Marlowe just kind of waking up in modern day Los Angeles. And I have debates among my crime writer friends about, some people love that film and some people hate it, because it really isn't very much like the novel. It really deviates from the book. But I love it. I think it's terrific, and I think that Chandler would have liked it.
With when it comes to writing, are you a bit of a research junkie? Do you like to find out those real histories and kind of, those facsimiles?
Oh,
and draw
man.
from that?
I'm too much of a research junkie to the point where it really can hurt my writing, where I should be in getting into the book and doing something. So I just finished this book. So I've written 3 series. I did the Nick Travers series, and that's what we're talking about. But then, of course, as we've mentioned, I do the Spencer series that are set in Boston. But the main thing that I do is, for the last 10 years, I've been writing about a character who's in Mississippi, who's a sheriff, kind of in this vein of like Buford Pusser and going back to those films like Billy Jack. And so I write a character named Quinn Colson, and it's in this fictional county in Mississippi called Tibahaw County, and it's about crime and corruption and all that stuff. So the latest book that I was working on dealt a lot with truck drivers. And so, I knew people who were truck drivers. I've got a buddy mine who's a dispatcher, and we talked about that kind of stuff. But it was like this was just for maybe a tenth of the book. This was not the major part of the book, but it was dealing with it. But it was like I couldn't rest until I kept on thinking I need to go to truck driving school. I need to go to truck driving school. I need to actually go out on the road. I need to be driving trucks. And it was finally my wife who dialed me in, and she said, "I think you're okay with the."
No one's going to fact check you on that. Yeah.
Yeah, you're not going to actually have to run an 18-wheeler. I think you're going to be okay with just the couple scenes you had.
I always feel like
I do.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that stuff. I love to research, and another part of the book that I just finished is called The Sinners, and it's coming out this summer. Is dirt track racing, which is I don't know if you guys have that in Virginia, but it's short track racing, like it's quarter mile racing on a dirt track. And so I got into that and was able to go to a lot of the dirt track racing and meet the drivers and kind of get into that whole culture. And I love it. Yeah, I love the research.
I always felt like after reading Moby Dick, you can figure out how to run a whaling ship in the 18th century.
Sure, absolutely. Melville was into it. He's like, "Tell me all you know."
Yeah. Call me Ishmael. But so Ace, something we ask everybody that comes on the show.
Okay.
What are you currently geeking out over?
Man, what am I geeking out over? Does it count? Before I got on the phone with you guys, I just watched Lost in Space on Netflix. I was when I was a kid, Lost in Space was in reruns, and I used to watch it every day, and so I'm really geeking out. I just watched the first episode of the show, but it was really terrific. It was really well done. So I'm geeking out over that. Of course, I'm geeking out over Infinity War coming out.
Mm-hmm.
The Solo movie. I mean, there's just too much. There's just too much coming out this summer. Jurassic World. I'm a big movie guy, so I'm looking forward to all that stuff.
I never had watched anything Lost in Space related. I mean, I knew about it. I mean, it's there in history forever. Everyone knows at least Danger Will Robinson, from Lost in Space. I watched the first.
Only ran for 3 seasons, like the original Star Trek too.
I watched the first episode recently, and I was totally blown away. Like it was just really just fun, and it felt kind of Spielbergian, towards the end with the robot, and I really liked it a lot.
I thought it was terrific, and I was a big fan of the original. The original, of course, is super campy,
mm-hmm.
but there's so many lousy ideas coming out of Hollywood. But to do a reboot of Lost in Space, but to do it as realistic as possible, I thought it was really clever. So I'm into that, and I'm always catching new shows that are coming on. There's it's an interesting time for people that are into movies and books and all that. There's a lot of stuff coming out, and some of it's not so great, but some of it's just fantastic. And I'm a big Star Wars guy, and so I love anything new Star Wars that's coming out. So I'm can't wait for Solo as well.
Are you more of the 3 new films? Which would you say is your favorite?
I really liked Force Awakens. I really did, and I was there opening night, and I could not wait. And you have to imagine, for me, at my age, I was 7 years old in 1977, and I remember quite clearly going into the theater and seeing Star Wars and just being absolutely blown away by it, and waiting for Empire. It seemed like 50 years for Empire to come back, and of course Empire, as we all know, we're adults, we know that's the best one. But I thought Force Awakens was terrific, and I really, as a writer and somebody who's a novelist, like I said, I don't really think that some of the failings as far as some of the repetition, all that, I don't really find that a problem in the story. I love how it felt aesthetically like a Star Wars movie, and I liked all the practical effects, and I liked, I'm a big fan of Lawrence Kasdan, who, of course, wrote Empire and wrote Raiders of the Lost Ark, and one of the best screenwriters there is. I just loved the script. I thought it was just fantastic, and I had a great time. And then, I enjoyed The Last Jedi, but I didn't have that same feeling. I didn't have that same feeling of excitement. I thought it felt a little bit more like the prequels. But, I'm holding out for Solo. It's another Lawrence Kasdan script. And so I'm hoping it's going to, kind of rekindle those kind of, feelings of the original films.
One of my favorite Lawrence Kasdan movies is that nobody talks about?
Silverado?
No, it's Wyatt Earp. I love the movie Wyatt Earp. I know everyone talks about Tombstone. Tombstone's great, but I love...
But you're Team Costner.
Well, I love Kevin Costner, but I also think that Wyatt Earp, however fictional his life is, is...
Well, I think Wyatt Earp got, it got overlooked because, it came out after Tombstone.
Yeah.
There were those competing movies, and people forget about it. But Kasdan's just fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned Silverado. I heard you guys mention Silverado. I just got a copy. It's funny you mentioned that. There's so much. If you watch Silverado and then you watch Force Awakens, you'll find so many parallels between those two films, down to the fact of having, the bar owner, being a very, small, very tough woman who's running as the barkeep that kind of keeps everything all in order.
Mm-hmm.
And, there's a lot of those things, a lot of those themes as far as friendship and trust and honor and all that. Because it's just fantastic. He's just a fantastic writer. So I'm not really thrilled about the casting of Solo. I don't really know who could be a young Harrison Ford for sure. But I think the script will be good. But yeah, no, I love Wyatt Earp, but I love Silverado, and so many of his films. Body Heat.
I forgot about Body Heat. Speaking of noir, that's right, in that wheelhouse.
Yeah.
Right. Well, Ace, before we return you to the wilds of Alabama, is there anything else you'd like to plug?
Well, I definitely I've got a new Spencer novel coming out, next week. And I'll be on a national tour for that. So if anyone wants to go to my website, they can see where I'll be. And then I've got my new Quinn Colson book that is very southern, gritty noir. That'll be out in July. And then, of course, what we're plugging right here, which is Crossroad Blues, which is a return all the way back around to my original creation of Nick Travers. And so cool that will be out at the end of this month.
It's like a full circle moment, man.
Oh, yeah.
That is. And then I will be on the off-Broadway performance of RoboCop.
Oh, perfect.
Well.
Yeah.
Right on. Coleman Murphy.
It's a beautiful, touching film. It's a wonderful production.
Excellent. I hope we'll have tickets at the box office waiting for us.
Yeah. Get that VIP access to see.
That's right.
Yeah, I trust you'll be Officer Alex Murphy for this production. But not Blues Brothers 2000.
No.
No, let's just erase that from our memories. I'm going to actually, from you guys bringing that up, I'm going to wake up about 3 o'clock this morning, and I'm going to have memories of some of the dance numbers with Dan Aykroyd. It's just going to ruin my night. So thanks for that.
The thing that pissed me off the most about that, other than I guess the quality of the film, is the fact that movie came out in 1998 and it's called Blues Brothers 2000.
Well, I guess they were just planning for the future. But it shows you though that you can, sometimes with films like that, you just can't, and I'm a blues purist. I love blues. I love all. But but the first movie is just fantastic. But sometimes you just can't, recreate that magic.
Yeah, it's like that movie's lightning in a bottle. It's one of my favorite films of all time.
Oh, fantastic! I mean, and it also, it really did, bring to the forefront artists that people had forgotten about over the years. And
yeah,
I think really, brought them to light again, and I thought that was a cool thing too.
I think it's kind of wild. Everybody forgets that Briefcase Full of Blues went like double platinum. Like that was a
yeah, absolutely. And that all came from, as I'm sure you know, but all came from Paul Schaefer. Paul Schaefer had that idea to kind of put this thing together, and Belushi and Aykroyd were kind of interested in this stuff, but didn't totally know about it. But Paul Schaefer was such a brain on rhythm and blues and old blues music and whatever that he put that whole thing together, and then brought that great band together, which they are. I mean, the band. I mean, to have Duck Dunn and Steve Cropper, and I got to meet Matt Guitar Murphy years ago.
Whoa!
really, really cool. I think I was talking about geeking out. I was totally geeking out meeting Matt Guitar Murphy. I kind of turned into like Chris Farley in that sketch where he does the interviews. And, but yeah, I don't know. Great stuff.
Yeah. Well, again, Crossroad Blues out in comic book stores and Comixology everywhere on Wednesday, April 25th. Keep an eye out for future Spencer novels and the upcoming Ace Atkins book tour. Ace, thanks again for coming on the show. And, of course, Ace's off-Broadway production of RoboCop.
Yes.
Please, thank you very much.
Yeah, of course.
You'll laugh, you'll cry, you'll run the gamut of emotions.
But Ace, thanks again for coming on the show.
Hey, my pleasure. Thanks, guys.
This has been another Geek Out production. If you enjoyed what you heard, hey, we've got a special episode every Friday. Of course, there's the usual catching up show every Wednesday, and you get book club episodes just about every Tuesday these days. Thanks for listening.